We have started.
Hello members. Okay, this is a presentation by a group about exception handling by KANYESIGYE, Simon, TUMUHIMBISE, DIANAH, NASASIRA, IREEN, and me, ASIMIRE. Exception handling in C#. An exception is defined as an event that occurs during the execution of a program that is unexpected by the program code. The actions to be performed in case of occurrence of an exception is not known to the program. In such a case, we create an exception object and call the exception handler code. The execution of an exception handler so that the program code does not crash is called exception handling. Exception handling is important because it gracefully handles an unwanted event, an exception, so that the program code still makes sense to the user. Keyword definition: try. Use it to define a try block. This block holds the code that may throw an exception. Catch. Use it to define a catch box. This block catches the exception thrown by try block. Finally. Use it to define the finally block. This block holds the default code. Then throw. Use it to throw an exception manually. This is an example to show how exception occurs in the program. Runtime error, unhandled exception, system index out of range exception. Index was outside the bounds of the array. Then at GFG main systems tree. Then it is runtime error, then the output, then in the code given above, the array name as shown here is defined for 5 elements, indices 0 to 4. When we try out the array that is non-existent, program code throws an exception and the above message is displayed. Let me invite my fellow to present to you the next slide, that is Simon.
I'm going to discuss about exception handling using a try-catch block as was defined here. So now, exception handling using a catch block. The given code below shows you how can handle exceptions using a try-catch block. The code that may generate an exception is placed inside the block, the try block. In case the access to the ninth element is put inside the try block, when that statement is executed, an exception is generated, which is called by the catch block. The object of the type index out of range exception is used to display a message to the user about the exception that has occurred. So this is the syntax. We try the statement that may cause an exception, which is catch exception object. Then an example is here. Here we are trying to catch an exception using a try-catch block. We are using these arrays as illustrated below, and the console.return is will catch an exception that has occurred in a message. Then the output is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then an exception has occurred in index was outside of the bounds of the array, which is here in the example that has been given. So now let me invite my colleague for another catch block.
Yeah, then here to describe about using multiple try-catch blocks. In the code given below, we attempt to generate the exception in the try block and catch it in one of the multiple catch blocks. Multiple catch blocks are used when we are not sure about the exception type that may be generated, so we write different blocks to tackle any type of exception that is encountered. The finary block is the part of the code that has to be executed irrespective of if the exception was generated or not. In the program given below, the elements of the array are displayed in the final block. This is our syntax. Then the example and the output. An exception has occurred. Attempted to divide by 0, 19, 0, 7, 75, 52. So let me invite my colleague to continue with slides.
This is Irene presenting the next slide, that is user-defined exceptions. User-defined exceptions are useful when we want to code an exception that may not be defined by the language. For example, in a boiler room, if the temperature rises above some threshold, then the heat must be turned off. For understanding how user-defined exceptions are used, we take an example of a division by zero. Here we define a class div by zero that inherits from exception and is called by the division operation function when the denominator is equal to 0. Since the call for the function may or not throw an exception, it is pressed in the try block. A cut block is defined to cut any exception with type exception, and the message property prints the type of exception that has occurred. An example is here to show the user-defined exception. Then the output of our example is exception has occurred. Exception of type div by 0 was thrown. That's what we had. Thank you for hearing.
Have a good afternoon.